The morning of June 17th, 1775, broke gray and humid over Boston Harbor, but Colonel William Prescott felt no foreboding as he gazed across the water toward the sleeping British fleet. Behind him, nearly 1,200 colonial militia worked frantically in the pre-dawn darkness, their shovels biting into the rocky soil of Breed's Hill with desperate urgency. They had been digging all night, transforming the strategic heights overlooking Charlestown into what would become one of history's most famous earthworks. Prescott wiped sweat from his weathered brow, knowing full well that when the sun rose higher, those British warships would awaken to find colonial fortifications staring down their throats. The audacity of their position was not lost on him. They had literally built their fortress under the noses of the world's most powerful navy, but this was no reckless gamble. It was calculated defiance born from months of escalating tension. Following the massacres at Lexington and Concord 2 months prior, the colonial leadership had debated this move for weeks. Dr. Joseph Warren, the charismatic physician turned revolutionary leader, had been among the most vocal advocates for seizing the heights. We must force their hand, Warren had argued in the smoky backrooms of Boston's taverns where revolution was planned. Let them come to us, where we choose the ground. His words carried weight among the Massachusetts Committee of Safety, who ultimately approved this daring nighttime operation. As dawn crept across the harbor, British sentries aboard HMS Lively began to make out the impossible sight before them. Where yesterday there had been empty pastureland, now stood an impressive redoubt bristling with cannon and crowned with the defiant figures of armed colonists. Captain Thomas Bishop of the Lively was among the first to spot the fortifications, immediately ordering his ship's guns to open fire. The thunderous boom of naval artillery echoed across Boston, serving as an unwelcome alarm clock for both British commanders and colonial defenders alike. General Thomas Gage, military governor of Massachusetts, received the shocking news in his comfortable quarters overlooking Boston Common. The colonials had achieved what his own military engineers had deemed nearly impossible. They had fortified Bunker Hill and its adjacent heights in a single night. Gage's immediate concern was not just strategic, but psychological. Allowing such insolence to stand would signal British weakness to colonials throughout America. Major General William Howe, recently arrived from England with reinforcements, studied the situation with professional interest. A veteran of European warfare, he recognized both the tactical challenge and opportunity before them. The colonials had indeed seized advantageous ground, but they had also trapped themselves on a peninsula with limited escape routes. They have made themselves a target, Howe reportedly told his staff officers. Now we shall see what these farmer soldiers are truly made of. By mid-morning, the British fleet had positioned itself for maximum effect, with HMS Somerset, HMS Glasgow, and several smaller vessels forming a devastating arc of firepower. The thunderous naval bombardment that followed would serve as prelude to what many historians now recognize as the bloodiest engagement of the early Revolutionary period. Yet even as British shells rained down upon their positions, the colonial defenders displayed a remarkable composure that would define their conduct throughout the coming battle. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers, merchants, and artisans who had answered liberty's call. The news of colonial fortifications spread through British ranks like wildfire, transforming what had been a routine morning into frantic preparation for major assault. General Gage convened his war council immediately, summoning his most experienced commanders to address this unprecedented challenge. The room buzzed with urgent discussion as maps were spread across polished tables, and the full implications of the colonial gambit became clear. Major General Henry Clinton, known for his tactical brilliance, advocated for a flanking maneuver that would cut off colonial retreat routes, trap them against the harbor, he urged, pointing decisively at the narrow neck connecting the peninsula to the mainland, force them to surrender or drown. His plan possessed elegant simplicity: land forces at the rear, while naval guns commanded the front, creating an inescapable vice. However, Major General William Howe possessed different ideas about colonial psychology. Having observed American fighting methods during previous conflicts, he believed a direct frontal assault would better serve British interests. These provincials must see British steel up close, Howe declared with characteristic confidence. Once they witness our bayonets advancing in proper formation, their courage will evaporate like morning mist. His assessment reflected traditional European military thinking, where disciplined infantry charges typically shattered militia resistance. According to historical accounts, Documented in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, the debate between these approaches consumed precious morning hours. General Gage ultimately deferred to Howe's experience, authorizing a direct assault despite Clinton's reservations. This decision would prove costlier than anyone anticipated, but it reflected British confidence in their military superiority over colonial amateur soldiers. The British preparation revealed the full might of 18th century military power. The 63rd Regiment of Foot, recently arrived from Ireland, formed the assault's backbone alongside the battle-tested 5th Regiment and the elite light infantry companies. These were professional soldiers who had served across the empire, from the Caribbean sugar islands to the German battlefields, bearing scars and experience that should have easily overwhelmed colonial resistance. Colonel James Abercrombie commanded the Grenadier Companies, tall men selected for physical prowess and courage under fire. Their towering mitre caps and precise movements embodied British military tradition, stretching back generations. Watching them form ranks in Boston Common, local loyalists felt renewed confidence that this colonial rebellion would soon collapse under imperial might. The artillery preparation began in earnest as British gunners wheeled their field pieces into position. 6-pounder and 12-pounder cannons, supplemented by howitzers capable of lobbing explosive shells over fortifications, established a devastating battery on Copp's Hill. Combined with continued naval bombardment, this firepower should have reduced colonial earthworks to rubble within hours. Yet the defenders proved remarkably resilient under this punishment. Colonel Prescott moved among his men with calm determination, his presence steadying nerves frayed by constant explosions. When cannonballs struck their redoubt, the colonials quickly repaired damage with dirt and fascins, maintaining their protective walls despite relentless pounding. Captain John Chester of the Connecticut militia later wrote about the surreal quality of those morning hours. The enemy's shot flew thick about our ears, yet our men showed surprising steadiness for troops so little experienced in warfare. This composure would prove crucial as British assault troops began their final preparations. By early afternoon, approximately 2,200 British soldiers had assembled for the attack. Their redcoats gleamed in the summer sun as they formed into precise columns, creating an imposing sight that should have intimidated any reasonable opponent. Officers checked their men's equipment one final time, ensuring bayonets were properly fixed and ammunition pouches full. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge every assumption about colonial fighting ability and British military invincibility. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly as British assault columns began their deliberate advance. Across the Charlestown Peninsula, Major General William Howe, resplendent in his scarlet uniform and gorget of rank, personally led the right wing toward the colonial redoubt crowning Breed's Hill. Behind him marched the cream of British military grenadiers, whose towering caps caught the sunlight. Light infantry trained in the forests of North America, and line regiments whose disciplined ranks had broken enemies across 3 continents. The colonial defenders watched this magnificent display with a mixture of awe and determination. Many had never seen such a perfectly orchestrated military machine in action. The British advanced with textbook precision, their formations maintaining perfect alignment despite the rough terrain. Fifes and drums provided cadence, while officers on horseback directed movements with practiced efficiency. It was warfare's art form, executed by professionals who had never known defeat in such circumstances. Colonel William Prescott moved along his defensive line, offering encouragement. 2 men whose faces betrayed various degrees of nervousness. "Don't fire until you can see the whites of their eyes," became the rallying cry, though historical evidence suggests this famous phrase may have originated with Andrew McClary of New Hampshire or Israel Putnam rather than Prescott himself. Regardless of its source, the command embodied the tactical necessity facing colonial forces. Their limited ammunition required every shot to count. The first British assault wave struck like a crimson tide against the earthworks. Howe's men advanced with magnificent courage, their bayonets gleaming as they approached the colonial lines. The defenders held their fire until the enemy came within 50 yards, then unleashed a devastating volley that shattered British ranks like glass. Soldiers who moments before had epitomized military perfection suddenly crumpled or staggered backward, their formations dissolving into chaos. Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines, the same officer who had commanded at Lexington Green 2 months earlier, fell mortally wounded while rallying his men for another charge. His death symbolized the unexpected lethality of colonial resistance. These farmer soldiers were proving far more dangerous than British intelligence had suggested. The psychological impact of losing such experienced leaders rippled through British ranks, shaking confidence that had seemed unbreakable. According to research published in the Journal of the American Revolution, British casualties during these initial assaults reached staggering proportions. Entire companies found themselves decimated by precise colonial marksmanship, their officers falling in disproportionate numbers due to deliberate targeting. The Americans had learned from frontier warfare that eliminating leadership could paralyze European-style formations, and they applied this knowledge with devastating effectiveness. Howe himself narrowly escaped death when a musket ball shattered his sword hilt and another pierced his uniform without touching flesh. Around him, his staff officers and aide-de-camps fell in rapid succession, leaving the general increasingly isolated on the bullet-swept field. Yet with remarkable personal courage, he continued rallying his men for repeated assaults against positions that seemed impregnable. The British light infantry, attempting to flank colonial positions along the Mystic River, encountered equally fierce resistance from New Hampshire troops under Colonel John Stark. These men had constructed a stone wall extending down to the water's edge, creating an additional killing ground that claimed hundreds of British casualties. Stark's famous declaration, "We'll beat the enemy or Molly Stark sleeps a widow tonight," captured the grim determination pervading colonial ranks. Captain Walter Laurie of the 43rd Regiment later wrote about the horror of those charges. "The enemy seemed to choose their marks with deadly precision, and our finest soldiers fell like wheat before the scythe." This testimony from British participants reveals how completely the engagement defied their expectations of easy victory over colonial militia. By late afternoon, British assault columns had been repulsed twice with catastrophic losses. Dead and wounded redcoats littered the approaches to colonial fortifications, creating obstacles for subsequent attacks. The sight of so much carnage began affecting British morale, as surviving soldiers questioned whether any position could justify such sacrifice. Yet colonial ammunition was running critically low, a fact that astute British observers began to notice as the defensive fire slackened perceptibly. The third British assault began with grim determination rather than confident expectation. Major General William Howe, his uniform torn and stained with the blood of fallen officers, had learned bitter lessons from his previous failures. This time, British troops would advance without the heavy packs that had encumbered earlier attacks, and they would rely on cold steel rather than prolonged firefights that favored colonial marksmen. Dr. Joseph Warren, the beloved physician and political leader who had helped orchestrate this confrontation, arrived at the redoubt during the brief lull between attacks. Despite his prominent position in the revolutionary movement, Warren had insisted on fighting as a simple volunteer, refusing the general's commission recently offered by the Provincial Congress. His presence electrified the defenders, who recognized that Massachusetts' most eloquent spokesman for liberty had chosen to share their desperate circumstances. The ammunition crisis had become acute throughout the colonial lines. Soldiers searched desperately through cartridge boxes, many finding only a few rounds remaining for what promised to be the decisive encounter. Some resorted to loading their muskets with nails, broken glass, and metal scraps, anything that might inflict damage on approaching enemies. Others prepared to use their firearms as clubs once powder and shot were exhausted. Colonel Prescott made the agonizing decision to conserve remaining ammunition for point-blank range, knowing this would allow British forces to advance much closer before meeting resistance. His men watched nervously as redcoat formations reformed for another assault, their ranks now reinforced with fresh troops brought across from Boston. The psychological pressure of waiting while enemy soldiers prepared to kill them tested colonial resolve to its limits. British artillery had finally found effective range, with cannonballs now regularly striking the redoubt and causing significant casualties. One shot decapitated a colonial soldier standing near Prescott, spattering the colonel with blood and brains, but failing to shake his composure. Such horrific incidents were becoming commonplace as the bombardment intensified, creating additional stress for men already pushed to breaking points. The final British advance commenced with almost funeral solemnity. Gone were the fifes and drums that had marked earlier assaults. Now only the steady tramp of boots and occasional shouted commands broke the afternoon stillness. Howe had deployed his men in looser formations that presented smaller targets, while light infantry companies prepared to exploit any gaps that appeared in colonial defenses. When the defenders finally opened fire, Their volleys lacked the devastating concentration of earlier engagements. British soldiers who braced for annihilation instead found themselves facing scattered shots that, while deadly to individuals, could no longer halt entire formations. The psychological balance had shifted decisively. Now it was colonial troops who felt the cold touch of approaching defeat. Research from the Boston Public Library's archives indicates that the breakthrough occurred near the redoubt's left flank, where Connecticut troops under Captain Thomas Knowlton had begun falling back due to ammunition shortages. British light infantry, recognizing the opportunity, poured through the gap and began rolling up colonial positions from the exposed side. What had been orderly defense suddenly transformed into desperate hand-to-hand combat. Dr. Warren fell during these final moments, struck down by a musket ball while attempting to rally retreating soldiers. His death marked the symbolic end of organized colonial resistance, as surviving defenders began streaming toward the Charlestown Neck in increasingly panicked flight. The man who had proclaimed that Americans would die freemen rather than live slaves had kept faith with his own rhetoric, paying liberty's ultimate price. The British finally gained their objective, but at costs that staggered even hardened military professionals. Officers who had served in European campaigns declared they had never witnessed such carnage in proportion to numbers engaged. Entire companies had been reduced to mere handfuls of survivors, and the officer corps had suffered particularly severe casualties that would affect British operational capability for months to come. As smoke cleared over Breed's Hill, the true magnitude of this victory became apparent to both sides. The silence that followed the final British assault was more terrifying than the battle's thunder had been. Across Breed's Hill's blood-soaked slopes, the moans of wounded soldiers created a haunting symphony that would echo in survivors' memories for decades. Major General William Howe stood atop the captured redoubt, surveying carnage that defied his worst expectations and transformed tactical victory into strategic catastrophe. British casualties exceeded 1,000 men from an attacking force, a barely 2,200, a loss rate of nearly 50%. That would have been considered disastrous in any European engagement. More shocking still was the disproportionate toll among officers whose conspicuous uniforms and mounted positions had made them priority targets for colonial marksmen. 90 British officers lay dead or wounded, including many regimental commanders whose loss would cripple British effectiveness. For the remainder of the siege, the 47th Regiment of Foot had been virtually annihilated, losing 250 men from its original strength of 350. Company after company reported casualty rates exceeding 80%, with some units reduced to fewer than a dozen effective soldiers. These were not militia or hastily recruited levies, but professional soldiers representing Britain's finest military traditions, men whose loss could not be easily replaced. In America's isolated theater of operations, Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie of the Grenadiers, wounded 3 times during the assault, later wrote to his brother in Scotland, "We have gained a dear-bought victory, if victory it may be called, where we have lost more brave fellows than the colonials had in their entire army." His assessment captured the bitter irony of Britain's position. They had won the field, but lost the initiative, gained a hill, but surrendered psychological advantage. Colonial losses, while significant in absolute terms, represented a fraction of British casualties. Approximately 450 Americans had been killed, wounded, or captured, including the irreplaceable Dr. Warren, whose death grieved patriots throughout the colonies. Yet for every colonial casualty, the British had suffered more than the losses among troops they could ill afford to spare in hostile territory. 3,000 miles from reinforcement, King George III, upon receiving news of the engagement through dispatches that reached London in late July, reportedly declared, "I wish we could sell them another hill at the same price." His sardonic observation reflected growing royal recognition that subduing American rebellion would require far greater resources than originally anticipated. The easy conquest that British planners had envisioned was evaporating in the smoke of colonial musketry. According to documents preserved in the British National Archives, General Thomas Gage immediately began requesting massive reinforcements from London, estimating that at least 10,000 additional troops would be needed to maintain British positions around Boston. His dispatches painted an increasingly grim picture of colonial capabilities, describing rebel forces as numerous, determined, and far better disciplined than we had reason to expect. From such raw levies, the psychological impact on British forces proved as damaging as physical casualties. Soldiers who had confidently expected to scatter colonial militia with a single charge now questioned their leaders' assessment of enemy capabilities. Morale plummeted throughout the army as word spread of the massacre on Breed's Hill, creating disciplinary problems that would plague British commanders throughout the siege. Colonial forces, despite their tactical defeat and retreat, experienced entirely different psychological effects. The Massachusetts Committee of Safety quickly recognized the propaganda value of their soldiers' performance, emphasizing that untrained Americans had stood against Europe's finest troops and inflicted unprecedented casualties. This narrative of moral victory despite tactical defeat would become central to Revolutionary mythology. General Artemas Ward, commanding colonial forces around Boston, used the engagement's aftermath to argue for continued resistance. "Our men have proven they can fight," he declared to the Continental Congress. "Given adequate supplies and support, they will make the enemy pay dearly for every foot of American soil." His assessment proved prescient, as British forces would remain essentially trapped in Boston for the next 9 months. The international implications began manifesting almost immediately, as foreign observers recognized that Britain faced a far more formidable challenge than anyone had anticipated. The aftermath of Bunker Hill reverberated far beyond the blood-stained peninsula, where it was fought, sending shockwaves through diplomatic chancelleries across Europe and transforming international perceptions of American military capabilities. French Foreign Minister Charles Gravier, Count of Vergennes, received detailed reports of the engagement within weeks, immediately recognizing its implications for France's century-long rivalry with Britain. In the elegant salons of Versailles, where European balance of power was delicately calibrated, news of massive British casualties at the hands of colonial militia created unprecedented opportunity. King Louis XVI's advisors quickly grasped that Britain's American troubles might provide France with long-sought revenge for defeats suffered during the 7 Years' War. Secret discussions began almost immediately regarding potential support for American rebels, though official neutrality would be maintained for nearly 2 more years. Spanish ambassador to France, Jerimo Grimaldi, reported to Madrid that British military reputation had suffered irreparable damage, writing, "The colonials have proven that British regulars are not invincible, and this knowledge will spread throughout their American dominions." Spain's concerns centered on their own vast colonial empire, where news of successful resistance against European troops might inspire similar rebellions. From Mexico to Peru, within Britain itself, the political ramifications proved equally significant. Opposition members in Parliament, led by Edmund Burke and Charles James Fox, seized upon Bunker Hill casualties as evidence of ministerial incompetence in American policy. Burke's famous speech declaring that a great empire and little minds go ill together gained resonance as British public opinion began questioning the cost of subduing colonial rebellion. The London newspapers, initially confident of easy victory over American rabble, began publishing increasingly sobering accounts of colonial military prowess. The London Chronicle reported that our finest regiments had been handled most roughly by men we had dismissed as farmers and shopkeepers, while the Gentleman's Magazine published detailed casualty lists that brought the human cost of empire directly into British drawing rooms. Research from the papers of Benjamin Franklin reveals that American diplomats in Europe immediately recognized Bunker Hill's propaganda value. Franklin himself, representing colonial interests in France, used the engagement to argue that America possessed both the will and capability to resist British authority indefinitely. His sophisticated lobbying efforts helped establish the diplomatic foundations for future French alliance. Back in America, the Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia received news of the battle with mixed emotions. While delegates mourned Dr. Warren's death and grieved for colonial casualties, they recognized that their forces had achieved something remarkable. In standing against professional European troops, John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail that, "Our men have shown they possess courage equal to any soldiers in the world," a sentiment that boosted congressional confidence in authorizing continued resistance. The psychological transformation within American colonial society proved even more significant than immediate political reactions. Communities throughout the 13 colonies now possessed concrete evidence that British military power, while formidable, was not invincible. This knowledge emboldened resistance movements from Georgia to Maine, creating a revolutionary momentum that British officials found increasingly difficult to contain. General George Washington, recently appointed Commander-in-Chief of Continental Forces, arrived in Massachusetts just weeks after Bunker Hill to find an army transformed by combat experience. While he immediately recognized serious deficiencies in organization, supply, and discipline, Washington also discovered that his men possessed something invaluable: confidence, born from proving themselves under fire against Europe's finest soldiers. British commanders throughout America began adjusting their strategic calculations as news of Bunker Hill casualties spread through military channels. General Guy Carleton in Quebec, General John Campbell in West Florida, and other regional commanders all requested additional troops, while implementing more cautious policies toward colonial populations. The easy suppression of rebellion that London had anticipated was clearly impossible. Native American tribes throughout the continent also reassessed their diplomatic positions based on Bunker Hill's outcome. Many chiefs who had considered aligning with Britain began hedging their commitments, recognizing that the conflict might prove more prolonged and uncertain than originally expected. This diplomatic shift would have profound consequences for frontier warfare throughout the Revolution. As autumn leaves fell over New England in 1775, the true implications of that bloody June afternoon began crystallizing with startling clarity. The Battle of Bunker Hill had ended British illusions of easy conquest while birthing American confidence in their ability to resist the world's mightiest empire. What appeared to be colonial defeat had transformed into strategic victory of unprecedented magnitude. British forces remained trapped within Boston's confines, their initial strength so devastated by Bunker Hill casualties that meaningful offensive operations became impossible. General William Howe, promoted to replace the recalled Thomas Gage, found himself commanding an army more concerned with survival than conquest. The aggressive campaign to crush colonial rebellion in its infancy had devolved into desperate defense of a single port city. The siege dragged through winter months, with British troops suffering from inadequate supplies while colonial forces grew stronger through experience and reinforcement. International observers noted the remarkable reversal. Supposedly superior British regulars were being starved into submission by the same provincial rabble they had claimed to despise. This role reversal damaged British prestige throughout Europe while enhancing American credibility among potential allies. Continental Army recruitment surged as stories of Bunker Hill spread throughout the colonies. Young men who might have hesitated to confront British military power now volunteered eagerly, inspired by accounts of colonial soldiers standing firm against Europe's finest troops. The mythology surrounding the battle, farmers defeating professionals, democracy triumphing over tyranny, became central to revolutionary ideology. King Louis XVI of France, initially hesitant about supporting colonial rebels, found his position shifting as Bunker Hill's implications became clear. French military advisors argued that Britain's American troubles represented France's best opportunity to reclaim global dominance lost during previous wars. Secret French aid began flowing to American forces within months of the battle, setting diplomatic foundations for the alliance that would ultimately secure colonial independence. The financial costs of Bunker Hill extended far beyond immediate casualties, as Britain discovered that subduing American resistance would require unprecedented military expenditures. Lower North's government faced mounting pressure from Parliament and taxpayers who questioned whether American colonies were worth the enormous costs of reconquest. These economic concerns would eventually contribute to British willingness to negotiate peace. Modern historians, examining the engagement with analytical tools unavailable to 18th century observers, have reached striking conclusions about its significance. Professor David Hackett Fisher of Brandeis University argues in his acclaimed work that Bunker Hill represented the moment when American colonial resistance transformed from political protest into genuine military revolution capable of achieving independence. The tactical lessons learned on Breed's Hill would influence American military doctrine throughout the Revolution and beyond. Colonial commanders discovered that defensive positions, properly prepared and courageously held, could neutralize British advantages in training and equipment. These insights shaped subsequent engagements from Saratoga to Yorktown, contributing directly to ultimate American victory. Perhaps most significantly, Bunker Hill established the psychological foundation for American national identity. The willingness of ordinary citizens to sacrifice their lives resisting tyranny became central to revolutionary mythology, inspiring future generations of Americans facing their own challenges to freedom. The battle's legacy transcended its immediate military consequences to become a defining moment in American historical consciousness. British strategic thinking also evolved dramatically following Bunker Hill, as commanders recognized that subduing colonial rebellion would require fundamentally different approaches than traditional European warfare. The engagement taught British leaders that American resistance possessed depths and capabilities they had never anticipated, forcing strategic reassessments that ultimately proved inadequate to the challenge. Today, visitors to Bunker Hill Monument in Charlestown can contemplate the site where citizen soldiers first proved that determined resistance could challenge imperial power. The granite obelisk marking the battlefield serves as enduring testimony to the courage displayed on both sides during that terrible June afternoon, while commemorating the moment when American independence transformed from impossible dream into achievable reality. The question posed in our title, "Did the Patriots really lose at Bunker Hill?" finds its answer not in tactical movements or casualty counts, but in the battle's profound consequences for human liberty. Though colonial forces retreated from the field, they had won something far more valuable: proof that free people, fighting for their own soil and their own cause, could stand against any tyranny the world might send against them.